Hi, my name is Andrew Berkowitz, and this TED Talk is called Exposure Uproots Ignorance, a personal reflection on how an increase in exposure can lead to limitless possibilities. You don't know what you don't know. When I think about some of the biggest issues facing our nation in the context of racism, prejudice, and discrimination, I can't help but continuously point the finger toward ignorance. The word ignorance, despite our highly negative use of the word, has a very neutral definition, meaning a lack of knowledge or information. Each human being grows up with a certain amount of lived experiences, which fills their understanding of the world around them. Everything they don't experience becomes part of a void. That void is called ignorance. When Will Ferrell in Elf traveled to New York City from the North Pole, he was ignorant towards many of the norms and expectations of American culture. For example, when Buddy put syrup on his spaghetti, it was viewed as disrespectful and bizarre by his American family. Because Buddy was lacking knowledge, or ignorance, of American human culture, he was othered and unappreciated, some would even argue discriminated against. This is essentially what is continuing to happen in contemporary American culture all across the country. Because each person only has a certain set of lived experiences, we tend to view anyone outside of our own bubble of experiences as different and or wrong. A Texan used to Southern hospitality may appear offended by the brashness of a New Yorker if she is visiting for the first time, and a New Yorker may be annoyed by the slower paced living upon visiting the South. Again, this is not due to someone having the right or wrong set of experiences, but the result of two people having a lack of experiences that have failed to set them up for a positive understanding experience. Let me give you a personal example. I was born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a suburban city in eastern Pennsylvania that is home to the largest Amish community in the United States. In the 2015 census, Lancaster County, the area I was raised in, which you see in this picture, was reported as 91.5% white. I went to Lancaster Country Day School, a K through 12 private school that was almost 100% white and cost around $5,000 a year to attend. Growing up, we learned about the experiences of others in textbooks, but by the time I graduated, the information had never really come to life for me. Rather than truly internalizing the horrors of the Jim Crow laws in history class, or the consequences of being black during the Great Depression from our reading of The Bluest Eye in English class, I focused on enjoying the video games I had at home, or the trips to Spain and Italy my parents would take me on during the summer. These privileged experiences, while admittedly enjoyable, only shaped me to be incredibly unprepared for college and beyond when I would face the real world and come into contact with people that were very different than me and with very different experiences. College opened me up a little as I surrounded myself with very liberal-minded individuals, but it really wasn't until I moved to Atlanta where my bubble was truly burst. Within 5 weeks of being in Atlanta, I found myself a job at Booker T. Washington High School, the historic school that was not only the alma mater of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but was also the first black school in the South. As the newest Spanish teacher at the school, I would also be the only white teacher at the school whose demographics were nearly 100% African American. Booker T. Washington is housed in a neighborhood called Vine City, where the median household income is $23,000, with only 30% of its residents graduating with a high school degree. At Washington, 100% of students receive free lunch, and 61% of them come from single-parent households. To put it lightly, this was a much different environment than Lancaster, Pennsylvania. At Washington, I learned of the struggles and obstacles my students were faced with on a day-to-day basis and simultaneously became acutely aware of all the privileges and advantages I was granted growing up. When my students didn't show up to class, I learned that it could be due to a host of issues ranging from familial factors, school factors, economic influences, and student variables. In fact, a recent study supports that household income as well as parent supervision is directly tied to high truancy rates. It really put into perspective the fact that if I missed school, it was likely because of an orthodontist appointment or because I was on vacation. Two privileges that many of my students were not afforded. As I plugged away at trying to be the best teacher I could be and the best advocate and white ally for my students, I continuously sought to fill the gaps in the systems where my students were a victim of. I realized very quickly that my students' obstacles and barriers were a product of a hand poorly dealt as opposed to a hand poorly played. These new realizations challenged my closed-minded biases from the past, a mindset that used to believe in the meritocracy. Life is simple, work hard and it will pay off, to a newfound understanding of what inequity really means. The important realization that my students were running the same race I was, but from a much different starting point. The key turning point in my transformation stems from a simple idea that we've known forever but don't talk about nearly enough: exposure. My ignorance leading up to my Atlanta experience was simply due to a lack of exposure. This lack of exposure made me find a new appreciation for a famous Bob Dylan quote in The Times We Are Changin', which is, "Don't criticize what you can't understand." My whole life, I had been pretending to know more than I did, and I felt like I had the right to have opinions about things I knew nothing about. But now that I'd been so deeply woven into the fabric of the Washington and Atlanta community, teaching and advocating and mentoring my students for 3 years, I began to know that which I didn't know I didn't know. While I have transformed drastically from my old Pennsylvania self, I still will never truly understand other people's experiences because I only am me and I only have my own experiences. I can, however, now dedicate my life to learning and empathizing with those that are different than me, and taking that new understanding to educate and expose those that haven't had the same awakening that I've had. While I hesitate to sound like I'm asking for praise, because I'm not and I have so much more work to do to become a true catalyst for social change, I am proud to say I am no longer on the sidelines watching injustices tackle disenfranchised communities all across America. I have come to terms with the fact that silence is compliance, and if I'm not actively working to dismantle racism by exposing and educating others, then I am simply part of the problem. This realization happened around the end of my second year teaching, and it spawned my want to continue and teach for a third year, despite the majority of TFA core members leaving after 2. It also spawned the realization of another similar concept. My white bubble was not just unique to me, but it was also happening to my students too, but in a very different form. My black students from Vine City were also part of a bubble, albeit a very different bubble, where they only knew what they knew based on their limited lived experiences, which were based on the experiences their community, family, and environment had provided them. I thought to myself going into my third year, if I can have an eye-opening moment that changed my life, why can't my students as well? In other words, I asked myself, what parts of life have my students not experienced that I think they could truly benefit from? In some ways, I had already done it without even thinking it by starting a tennis program at my school and growing the program from 6 students to 25 students, taking my students to states in the third year. I have also exposed them to my Jewish culture and my white culture simply based on the things I say and the experiences I chose to share with them. But still, I wanted to go a little bit deeper. Thinking about Bloom's taxonomy and how the best learning comes from trying to tie curriculum to real-world application, I thought, what is the best way I can expose my students to something truly path-changing? My answer came to me when I was teaching a unit on travel vocabulary. As I taught the Spanish vocabulary for baggage claim, going through customs, or getting a passport, the majority of my students looked at me confused, unable to translate the words in English, let alone Spanish. It quickly became aware to me how very few of my students had ever been to an airport, let alone left their zip code. This was another moment of true ignorance on my part, and just another gap I became inspired to close. 6 months later, and $8,000 of fundraising later, I successfully took my students abroad to Costa Rica and Nicaragua, where dreams were truly made and horizons were truly expanded. In only a 2-week trip, my students gained a ton of new perspectives and came back with a much more open and adaptive attitude toward different cultures and ideas. Research supports the benefit of travel as well, as one clinical psychologist believes traveling gets you outside of your comfort zone, opening up new worlds and experiences. When you're faced with new scenarios and encounters, you learn effective coping strategies that help you survive and manage your fear of the unknown. It's funny and awesome to think that this exact awakening that my students had now received from traveling was the same awakening I had received and still continue to receive from moving to Atlanta and teaching at Washington. According to my student travelers, it was the best 2 weeks of their life, and I'm happy to say I have the same reflection. Even as I am now outside the classroom, working as a recruiter for Teach for America, I continue to use this newfound exposure to educate others that still live behind a veil of ignorance. I currently recruit at Emory, which has a large population of students that come from a very similar bubble to the one I grew up with, and it is a privilege each and every day to open up their perspectives even a little bit, and to share with them the new discoveries that I've just shared with you. All in all, I have learned three major things that I've taken with me as I continue my journey as a leader and as an ally. 1. You don't know what you don't know. Your gaps in information, aka ignorance, are boundless. 2. Learn to take ownership of these gaps while simultaneously seeking to expose yourself to as many different things as possible. If you refuse to admit you don't know something, you will never be able to grow. Ignorance is okay as long as we admit it and seek to learn more. And 3, engage others to do the same. If we want people around us to be better to each other, we have to expose them to what we know. We must also do so thoughtfully and to suspend judgment of others when they might not know. Like Buddy in Elf, we have to believe people can change through exposure and to not lose patience if change doesn't happen overnight. If these 3 steps are taken, or at least internalized in some way, then I truly believe we can start to repair some of the stark divisions that stain our country. Thank you so much for listening. My name has been Andrew Berkowitz.